Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to start looking at how we can just refine this model a little bit more and get it to looking like a complete kind of model before we take it into ZBrush. Now, I want to point out that at the beginning of this video that a lot of these steps are actually kind of optional. The fact of the matter is when we take this into ZBrush, we could technically do all of these steps inside of ZBrush, but we may have somewhat less control than we might like. And our final model may look a little bit less hard surface, a little bit less sort of refined. It might look a little bit more sculptorly or clay-like, depending on your handling in ZBrush. So the main thing that we're kind of looking at here is things like chamfers and things of that nature. So what we want to do is, for example, on a piece like this, we may want to kind of smooth this out. Right now it's a very, very hard-edged shape. So we may want to work with something that's a little bit smoother. So for example, we may want to chamfer this a bit more than it currently is being chamfered. Let's just do a full loop there and create something that's a little bit smoother on something like this. We could go relatively large with it. I'd say the larger that you go, usually the harder it is to keep that same kind of shape inside of ZBrush without things kind of bending and buckling. So just kind of keep that in mind, that at this stage we may want to just kind of chamfer things a little bit here inside of Max, just so we got things looking a little bit cleaner than they would be inside of ZBrush, while basically doing the same kind of thing. So we can pull that out, basically do the same distance here. Now, one thing we may want to do on this mesh, let's just kind of select this. We'll notice that some of this is not quite connecting the way that we want anymore. And it's not really looking like the kind of shape we want. So let's just taper this piece as well. Just so we're softening out all of those sections there. So we don't necessarily have to do that inside of ZBrush. Let's use the same number of cuts here as well, just to kind of make sure that these things go together nicely. And if certain parts aren't quite working, we can just kind of adjust these just a little bit. So this piece, for example, I think is a great candidate for us to select and use an FFD 2x2. This is really useful because it just gives you kind of large scale movement that you can kind of just collapse down. Now, the reason why we selected the geometry first was that it would mean that the FFD would only affect that geometry, not based on pivot points or anything like that. You could do it on single polygons as well. So that kind of just softens out this surface a little bit, and makes this also look a little bit more complete before we take this into ZBrush. Now we can do the same thing for other spots like this, such as this edge here. So for example, I'm going to delete this edge and this edge so that when I do my chamfer, I'm going to get a better edge than I would get otherwise. So for example, I'm just going to chamfer this. It's going to create the same settings that I had before, and you'll see it does quite a nice job. Now I can connect things back up through here, but if I were to do this with those two edges still intact, you'll notice the edge that I get here creates a whole bunch of extra information here and actually does not create the curvature that I wanted. I'd have to select this whole thing, which is not necessarily wrong, but may create some curvature that I don't want elsewhere and some extra edges that I actually don't even need. So in this case, again, we just delete those two pieces, because we can connect this back afterwards too. And we just chamfer off of that, and then we can go in here and just connect this back up. So I'm just control, and drag. Again, I'm using P-Connect for that. That's Shift-C for me. P-Connect uses a lot of modifiers when you're doing things, so you can kind of just connect through certain edges. It's a very, very useful tool. And that way, when we come back in here, let's just make sure that this edge does stay nice and hard for us here. Let's just go hard edged on that. Now I find, just so we're pointing it out here, sometimes you can use these hard edge selections here instead of smoothing groups. It'll still assign smoothing groups, but it's a little bit of an easier interface to work with. Problem is I find that it does tend to break quite a bit, at least on 2017, and you can lose your hard edge settings pretty quickly. So they're a little bit frustrating to work with sometimes. For example, you can see down here, like I've already lost some of my smoothing group settings here. It tends to be a little bit finicky to work with, especially if you use smoothing groups to begin with. But now we've got some shapes that are working a little bit better here. I'm also going to go down here into our section down here, and I'm just going to add an edit poly modifier on top. And for all of these edges, I'm actually just going to select everything and do a bit of a chamfer here as well, just to kind of harden out some of these shapes. I do want this to look kind of hard-edged like rock and stone, so I'm not too concerned about some, finicky little details in there. I just kind of want hard-looking stone. So that works pretty decent. There's a couple things I'm still missing here, such as this little inset, which I do want to make sure that I have first. So we can still just delete this piece. Let's keep the shell. So that's going to work out the way that we want. And let's just collapse that down in this case. Add an edit poly modifier, collapse 2, come in here, and we can start to add in some of that little shape that we want to have again. Now, in this case, for example, we could just kind of cut it in if we felt so inclined. So let's just do a cut in here along this angle, but basically all the way to that point. Now, I'm just going to take this, straighten that out, and I'm even going to take this edge and straighten it out as well, so that when I chamfer this, I get the exact kind of angle that's supposed to be appearing here as well, because they'll just kind of repeat themselves. So that's perfectly fine. I'll just take both these edges too, and just bring this down just a little bit so that that edge stays the same. All right. And then I can kind of just push this in with an extrude. So this kind of stuff becomes a little bit annoying to deal with. So you can just kind of see here, if I extrude this in, it's going to act a little bit funny. So what you may want to do, let's just pull this back out again. Actually, let's leave it here just for the sake of clarity. If I extrude this in, it's going to create a bunch of geometry that I don't want, such as this edge, for example. Now, you could instead just kind of delete the problem areas. Let's just grab this one again. Use our connect over here. Oh, let's grab that. And let's just connect this back down here. And in some cases, just kind of delete these problem areas, because then when you extrude, you can push that down a little bit. It's basically going to create this inset area, which we don't actually want. So just delete that, delete this inside area. And then you can kind of just connect things back up, because now you can just kind of bridge this area here. You'll end up with some spots that don't quite work, but again, we can just connect this back up, and I can use a target weld to just kind of connect this back together with this piece and do the same over here. Sometimes it's a little bit easier just to kind of clean a section up, so we can even just cap that there, try to connect these pieces together, and just use a collapse to kind of pull that all into one edge and just kind of clean that up a little bit more. Oh, there we go. This is still acting a little bit funny, but it's going to work out fine in ZBrush anyways. So sometimes it's easier just to kind of remove some of that information rather than try to keep it when it's just not going to be necessary. Let's just pull this edge back in as well so that this looks clean and maintained. Pull that back that way, and that'll work just great. So there we go. That works out pretty well. And in this case, we could still just select all of our edges and do that same chamfer that we were going to do before. Now, of course, again, you can make sure that you turn off smoothing on this as well, just so that that chamfer doesn't get too unwieldy. That's pretty good. If you don't want to include this area, just remember that chamfer is sort of a mode that we are in. We can just kind of deselect any parts that we don't want to be included in that chamfer so that we can increase its size to something that's going to be a little bit more appropriate for us as we kind of work through some of these details. So that's pretty decent. If there's little spots like at the bottom of this, I'm not really too concerned about them because we're just really not going to see them. There is, however, this metal section in the back which I may want to handle differently. So I'm just going to deselect that as well. And that's going to work out just fine. All right. So that's working out pretty good. And I can select, I think in this case too, all of these edges and do just a little bit of a chamfer on them as well, just to give something just a little bit softer on this piece. And I'm also going to set this chamfer type to a quad chamfer, which means I can kind of push out that geometry a little bit. Maybe just go with one division for this here, just to create sort of a softer shape in this section. Just go a little bit larger here. I think that'll look really, really nice in this case. Just kind of pull this whole section in so that it goes nice and flush with the rest of that shape. There we go. And any kind of sections like this too, again, you can always remove if you're starting to find that it looks like just a little bit too clean now. And you can harden those edges as well, or like chamfer them into something smaller so that that shape looks nice and sharp like that concept is intending it to look. It's pretty good. You just modify some of our little geometry shapes here just to make sure the proportions look right. Pull that over. Again, there's like a few geometry kind of problems here, and I'm really not concerned about them. These kind of things are not going to last once we take this into ZBrush, but if you're concerned about them and you want things to stay clean, that's perfectly fine. In fact, it's usually better to kind of keep stuff clean. Just pull this out a little bit. But stuff like this, I'm just going to collapse together and get rid of some excess edges that just may not be helping me out with some of my shapes here. Let's connect this together, remove that. In fact, remove this as well. There we go. None of that's needed in this case. None of that's going to help me or create the kind of shapes that I'm looking for here. And now that our model is cleaned up and ready to go, we're just going to start looking at, in our next module, diving into ZBrush and seeing how this model works inside there and getting things ready to start sculpting.